Okay, we'll begin. Sorry, we were expecting to hear from Jacob, and at least we didn't hear him here. We'll introduce ourselves, and we'll start out this webinar. I'm Joe Kearney. I'm in the computer science department at the University of Iowa, and with me is Jodie Plumert.
Hi, this is Jodie. I'm in the Psychological and Brain Sciences department.
We're going to talk about a set of studies looking at joint pedestrian road crossing in our Immersive Pedestrian simulator. This work is supported by the SaferSim UTC. It's conducted in the Hank Virtual Environments Lab, and you'll see here on the splash page here the URL for our lab, and you can go there to find out more about our work, to find about other projects that we have ongoing, and also to get copies of our papers and find out more about us. So much of our daily lives are spent interacting with others and performing joint actions with others. We're interested in looking at the consequences of these joint actions for road crossing and how groups of pedestrians cross roads together. One of the motivations for this comes from an intersection that sits right outside our building here at the University of Iowa and is a place where people cross from campus into downtown. And thousands of people cross there every day, oftentimes in groups of 2 or 3 or 4. There's a shot clock on the traffic light there that tells pedestrians when the light is going to turn. And every time that shot clock counts down, groups of pedestrians have to make go, no-go decisions about whether they're going to cross the intersection. And this is just an informal observation based on our standing at the corner. But it seems that they do this without chatting, without conversing, without explicit gestures. They just jointly coordinate their motion to make these decisions through subtle interactions and subtle gestures and motions. So what we want to do is see what are the consequences for road crossing with pairs of people in our immersive pedestrian simulator. This gives us an opportunity to do experiments that would be too dangerous to do in the real environment in a controllable and repeatable way. So there's a lot of studies that have been conducted on joint action, both neurophysiological studies and behavioral studies. This research indicates that we're wired to coordinate our actions with others. There are mirror neurons in the prefrontal cortex that fire when both watching and performing an action and are thought to be important for imitation and learning how to mimic the actions of others. There are also neurons that respond to in anticipation of actions. They prime you to respond to actions of others that are important when you're doing interactive activities such as catching a basketball. There's also a great deal of behavioral evidence for action coordination. So simply watching someone else perform an act increases the likelihood that you will as well perform the act, even when you didn't plan to do it. When people are asked to tap out rhythms, they spontaneously synchronize, even without instructions to do so. Observations of people walking together reveal that people tend to fall into a sort of lockstep in matching steps when walking side by side. And then further evidence is that when people are asked to cross through an aperture as a pair, that is, say, walking through a doorway, and are asked to make judgments about whether the doorway is large enough to accommodate their passing through, they'll take into account the other person in making those judgments. Oops, wrong way. So what does this have to do with crossing roads? Well, there's evidence that these kinds of behaviors, mimicking behaviors and coordination behaviors, are also important in transportation. So drivers will tend to match the following distance of surrounding traffic, and they're more likely to cross through a yellow light when other vehicles do so as well. In pedestrian road crossing, the likelihood that a pedestrian will cross against a red light is increased when those around them cross the red light as well. So what we're going to do is report here in this webinar on 3 different studies and give you a little peek into a 4th study that's currently in progress. The first two studies look at how two pedestrians jointly coordinate their decisions and actions in crossing traffic-filled roadways. So we'll compare crossing as an individual with how pairs cross the roadway together. We'll report on two studies. The first one is unacquainted adults who came into the lab. We introduced them and they crossed the road together in our pedestrian simulator. And the second looks at child friends and how they cross together. The second study we'll look at is how people who came into our lab and were paired with a computer-generated agent that could be either risky or safe. We call the agent Carl or Carla, depending on gender, how they cross the roadway and whether the riskiness of the agent influences the riskiness of the person who's matched with them. So I'll first tell you a little bit about our pedestrian simulator. This is a sketch of the simulator, and I think you can see my mouse. So the pedestrian simulator was built to be used for road crossing. We use cinematic aspect ratio in our projectors, and this allowed us to build a virtual environment that has a longer side screen than many virtual environments. There's in the lengthwise, it's 14.2 feet across, and that allows us to place a 10-foot road right through the middle of the simulator. The screens are 8 foot high and 10 foot across, so there's plenty of room for a sidewalk that two people can stand on. During the experiments, the two people stand at the open end of the simulator, and then they walk across the roadway to get to the other side. Traffic is generated down the road to the left-hand side, and during the simulation, it travels along the road, it enters into the simulator, and then crosses out the other side. And the task is for the pedestrians to stand at the edge of the road to safely pick a gap and to cross the gap to the other side. In order to get the right images projected for their unique position, we have a collection of motion tracking cameras that surround the top side and the back edge of the simulator. The participants wear a helmet that's outfitted with markers on it that you'll see in a minute. And this tracking system records where they are at every instance of the simulation, every time step. And we update the image so that it's correct for their location in the simulator. And you'll see how important that is when we look at some of the image sequences, the movies that are coming up from our simulations. So here's a video. This looks at how two people cross together, and you'll see there are actually two image streams, one for each viewer. It looks a little peculiar from our perspective because the geometry is right from their perspective, but not ours. So here is a replay and an animation that we produce after the simulation for inspection of the behaviors during the simulation. In the animation here on the right, those boxes represent the two road crossers, and that long nose you see in the box represents where they're looking as they're in the trial and the experiment. So the two different image streams are projected to the individuals. They have shutter glasses on here. You'll see on their face there the shutter glasses, and the shutter glasses are synchronized with the screen so that each one of them sees only one of those two image streams that's projected correctly for their point of view in the simulator. So this first experiment had two people. Each person had an independent non-stereo view. Prior to this experiment, we'd conducted another study that looked at the influence of stereo in these kinds of simulators. And what we found was that for the key performance variables, stereo and non-stereo behaviors were very similar. The size of gaps they took and the way they timed their motion was not significantly different between the two different conditions. So participants were instructed to cross the road without getting hit. They had no instructions about whether they should cross together or not. They had one practice trial, and then that was followed by 30 trials. One of the things you'll notice here is this tether that holds the participants. We find that when they have the shutter glasses on, the screens kind of dissolve. They focus really on the traffic, and we just wanted to make sure nobody walked through the front screen. So the only reason those are on there is to make sure people don't accidentally run into the front screen. The key performance variables that we looked at were how they chose gaps, what was the average size gap that they took, and what was the likelihood of accepting a gap of a certain size. We also looked at movement timing when they crossed the road. When they entered the road, what was the time of entry relative to the opening of the gap? That is the time the rear of the lead vehicle passed the pedestrian. Crossing time, and the time between when the pedestrian and the front of the tail vehicle clears when the pedestrian clears the path of the car. So it's the time left to spare when they get across the intersection. These are the gap acceptance results for when they cross together and when they cross separately. They cross together about 75% of the time. And when they crossed together, the two pedestrians on average picked larger gaps than did the solo crossers. So the solo crossers here is the solid line. The dotted line is the pair that crossed on this gap together. This graph is a logistic regression curve. It shows for the different gap sizes that were presented what the likelihood is that they would take that gap. So when gaps are small, they're very unlikely to take or never take. When gaps are large, they're likely or always take. What you'll see here is that the primary difference in these curves is the selectivity of the pair. They were more likely to pick big gaps and less likely to pick small gaps than were the solo individuals. On the right is a logistic regression graph of when they crossed separately. So when on roughly 25% of the trials, one person crossed first, and then the second person waited till a later gap and then crossed. And what you see here is that the person who crossed first is this line on the left side, the dotted line on the left side with the smaller dashes. The larger dashes here more towards the right, that's the second crosser. And in the middle is a repeat of the solo crossers that's in this graph to the left as well. That's provided there for comparison. And what you see is that those who crossed first were very much likely to take smaller gaps. And that's likely why the second crosser waited, is because the first crosser chose a very small gap. And even so, the second crosser then picked a larger gap than even when they crossed as a pair. So much more conservative second crosser than the first crosser. So now with respect to timing of entry, this shows the solar crossers, the left crossers, and the right crossers. The thing that stands out here is that the left crossers entered the road relative to the lead vehicle. That is, the time after the lead vehicle passed them, much later than did the right crosser. We believe this is because they were crossing together, and to stay in synchrony, the left crosser had to wait a short period of time until the lead vehicle passed the right crosser. So this is an indication that there's a joint coordinated action so that they would cross together and leave time for the pair to safely enter the road without running into the lead vehicle. And this is the time left to spare. That is the time between when they cross the road and the tail vehicle and the gap reach them. The solar crosser is on the left crosser and the right crosser. And what we see is that there's no significant difference between the time left to spare for the left, right, and solar crossers. The difference between the pair and or the lack of a difference between the pair and the solar crosser is likely due to the fact that they took larger gaps that accommodated the two of them. I think one of the interesting things is that the left crossers cross slightly faster, although not significantly faster than the right members, and that allowed them to make up for this time that they waited at the end. So they did a little bit of catching up when they crossed. So in summary, our first experiment here, pairs were highly likely to cross together, 75% of the time they crossed together. When they crossed together, they tightly synchronized their motion, entering the road within 0.19 seconds of one another. And the pairs picked larger gaps than solo crossers and timed their crossing to accommodate joint crossing together. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jodie, who's going to talk about the experiment with child friends.
Okay, so this is a study where we looked at how pairs of 12-year-old friends cross roads together. So this is different than the study that Joe just talked about, because these are kids who know each other well and in fact were recruited as pairs of friends. And so one reason that we care about looking at how pairs of friends cross is that we know that in early adolescence, kids start behaving in often a very risky way, and this includes their pedestrian behavior. And one of the reasons for this is that when kids are around friends or peers, it tends to heighten the systems in the brain that are more receptive to rewards and excitement, and that kind of counteracts any of their better judgment that they might exercise in a situation. And so that's one of the reasons why you see more risk-taking at this age when kids are with friends or with peers. So I'm going to show you a video of a pair of kids crossing together. Again, the setup is exactly the same as what Joe described with the pairs of unacquainted adults. So each of these kids are wearing stereo glasses, and they are getting either the right or the left images so that the viewpoint is going to be correct for them as they cross the road. Okay, so just to summarize the design and procedure again, so these were 48 12-year-olds. We had 16 pairs of friends and then 16 solo crossers. So they crossed a single lane of 25-mile-an-hour traffic for a total of 30 trials, either alone or in a pair. And the kids in the pairs switched their left-right position after 15 trials. The gap sizes range between 2 and 5 seconds on half-second intervals. So here what we see in this logistic regression graph is actually that there was no difference in gap selection between the solo kids who are in the dark solid line and the pairs when they were crossing together. So they pretty much, the kids who were in pairs crossed the same size gaps as kids who were crossing alone. And there's no difference in their discrimination of gap sizes, so they both have pretty much the same slopes there too. In terms of timing of entry, we see similar results to the adult pairs. Here, the pair members who stood on the right had a tighter timing of entry between themselves and the lead car in the gap than their pair members on the left, and also then the solo crossers here. And there's no difference between the kids who stood on the left and the solo crossers. So again, That occurs because if the pair members on the left and the right, enter the roadway at pretty much the same time, necessarily you're going to end up with kids on the right side having a tighter timing of entry behind the lead vehicle than the kids on the left side. And then if you look at time to spare, you can see that the kids on the right ended up with more time to spare than the solo crossers and the kids on the left, although the kids on the left ended up with the same time to spare as the solo crossers. So the kids on the left did cross a little bit faster so that they could make up for their slower timing of entry. So here again, the conclusions or the summary is that the 12-year-olds' gap decisions didn't differ when they crossed in pairs versus alone, and the pair members on the right cut in more closely behind the lead car and had more time to spare than the solo crossers. And this does contrast with the previous study that Joe just talked about, showing that the unacquainted adults will choose larger gaps when they're crossing in pairs, which allows for the time needed for both people to cross. So it looks like the children who are with their friends are not adjusting their gap decisions to accommodate joint action. Instead, what they tend to do is that they tend to cross the road faster, so they're adjusting their crossing actions to match their risky decisions. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it back over to Joe, and he's going to talk about crossing with a risky versus safe computer-generated character.
So this study followed on an earlier study we did in our bicycle simulator when we looked at how kids ride with a virtual bicycling peer who rode along with them that could be either risky or safe. And by risky, what we mean is they tended to take smaller gaps than the safe peer, which took larger gaps. And what we found there is that had a significant influence on the kinds of gaps the child took. Now in that one, we had the peer cross first, and then the child followed. And in this one, what we did is we just put the peer in there with them without explicit instructions about whether to cross with them or not. We wanted to see actually there were sort of two questions here we wanted to ask. And so one was, how will a computer-generated walking agent, or Carl that you see down there in the picture to the right, how will it influence the people crossing with it? If it is risky, will they be more risky? And second, we wanted to look at how people interact with real versus virtual partners in order to compare the difference in performance. How do you interact with a virtual character in a virtual environment? So the design of the experiment, we had a safe agent. The safe agent took there were a total of 7 gaps, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, and 5 seconds. The safe agent took only the largest 2 gaps. The gaps were presented in random order. So when a gap came, they took a gap if it was a sizable gap. The risky agent took, in addition to the 4.5 and 5 second, would take 3.5 and 4 seconds. So the first gap that came along that was 3.5 seconds or greater, the risky agent would take. And the real partner took whatever they would take. So here's the average gap size for the real partner, the safe agent, and the risky agent. And what you'll see is that the safe agent was on average more safe than the real people, the real partner, and the risky agent was more risky, took smaller gaps than a real person. So we have sort of a nice spread here of what your partner did. Now we always put the partner on the left. So the target individual we're looking at is on the right. And the reason for that is because the traffic is arriving from the left. We wanted to make sure that the agent or partner were in field of view of the target. So when there are 2 real people in there, the target is the one on the right. When the agent and the person are in there, the computer-generated agent, it's always the one on the left. There were 16 participants in each of these groups. So here's a video. there's Carl. I'll let that play a couple of times just so you can get a look at it. One more time. So Carl looks at traffic, and when the traffic comes, Carl is prepared, tracks the lead vehicle in the gap. That tracking, there's a little bit of a head whip as Carl follows the lead vehicle into the crossing through the intersection, and that's an important cue to tell the participant Carl's getting ready to go. So the basic questions here are how do the agents Carl and Carla, their gender match with the target? How do the agents influence people, and do they react similarly with a real and virtual partner? In addition to our usual performance variables, which are gap selection and movement timing, timing of entry, crossing time, and time to spare, we looked at partner interaction. So how did they synchronize, and what interpersonal distance did they keep between them and this virtual person that stood next to them? I should point out that for this experiment, we always had the target wearing the stereo glasses, so the image was correct for the target person. The image was always generated from their perspective. And the reason for this is when they wore the stereo glasses with the agent, it really pulls the agent off the screen, and it looks like a real character standing next to you. When you view it in non-stereo, it tends to sort of more look drawn on the screen. So here's the gap acceptance. This is, again, our logistic regression graphs. What you can see here is, let's see, this is, oops, pushing the wrong button. This is the risky here, the one towards the left on the curve. And when people crossed with the risky agent, they were more likely to take these smaller gaps. This is the real that's in the middle. And on the right-hand side is the safe. In the safe, they took slightly smaller. On average, they took smaller with the safe than the real and risky. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. They took a larger gaps when they were paired with a safe agent, but only marginally significantly different from the real. In the risky condition, they took smaller gaps than either the real and the safe conditions, and significantly so. So there's the 50% point, and there's the 3.5 second gap. And if you sort of track up from 3.5 seconds, you can see for those sort of marginally crossable gaps, what the difference is in the likelihood that they would take it in the three conditions. One of the things to point out here is the asymmetry in the size of the effect. And we'll see this again in a second. But the asymmetry shows that people are, one, more likely to cross. They cross 72% of the time with the risky peer and only 64% with the safe peer. But also they seem to have a larger influence on the average gap they picked. So with the risky peer, they were more likely to take significantly smaller gaps than with the safe peer taking larger gaps. So it seems like you can more likely convince someone to take more risk than you can convince them to be more safe. So now when they cross separately, there was a dramatic difference in the way that they crossed separately. So if you look at the bottom here of this chart, when they crossed alone, they crossed before the partner 4% of the time in the risky condition. So when they went by themselves, they almost always waited for a bigger gap when they're with a risky peer. When they're with the safe peer, 80% of the time they cross first. So what this meant was they were impatient and they crossed a smaller gap than the safe peer was willing to cross and crossed first. And so you can see here the difference in the average gap size that resulted. So in the risky peer condition, the targets had an average gap size of 4.33 seconds, while the risky peer had 3.83. They crossed after they crossed before the target did, sorry. In the safe peer condition, the safe peer crossed a gap of 4.75 seconds. The target crossed first and took a gap of 4 seconds, or average gap of 4 seconds. As when crossing with a real peer, they tend to cross in very tight synchrony when they cross together. We had some indication that they tended to match their road crossing speed. These show the trajectories when they cross the road. The sort of orangey color is the target in all three conditions. And in the blue is the partner. So it's a risky partner in the left side, the real partner in the middle, and the safe partner on the right. And they tended to cross very closely in synchrony. And in fact, it looks like they slowed their motion because we had programmed the peer to cross at an average rate that we had found in early experiments. And for whatever reason, they tended to cross faster in the two real peers in this condition. And so that was actually an interesting result to see how they tended to link up with the partner. So the summary of the results is that people prefer to cross with their partner, whether real or virtual. We found that they maintained a similar interpersonal distance, even though they weren't instructed to do so when standing next to a real or a virtual peer. And they exhibit very tight movement synchrony with both the real and the virtual partners. So the sort of headline result is that people do as their companions do. Pedestrians adjust their gap thresholds in response to computer-generated partners, and this is elicited with a relatively crude computer-aided agent. And that the result was asymmetric. There was a more powerful pull for the risky agent than for the safe agent.
Okay, so we're just going to show you a video of this particular study, but we have also started to do some work looking at how parents and kids cross roads together. And our interest here is in understanding more about how parents might teach their kids to cross roads and how they also negotiate the decision about when to cross together. So this study involved kids who were 8, 10, and 12 years old, and they came in with a parent and did the same kind of road crossing task as we've shown you before. We have both video and audio of their conversations, and we're in the process of coding those conversations as well as the kinds of behaviors that parents showed with the kids, because sometimes they would do things like hold an arm out to keep a child from crossing, or hold hands with the child when crossing, especially with the younger kids. And so we're interested in these behaviors that kids and their parents exhibit and how parents are perhaps teaching kids about safe road crossing. So I'll just show the video here of these two.
I'm just going to be counting in my head.
Last time after the purple car, there was plenty of space. Let's see. Not yet. 2 points.
I'm looking forward.
Watch the car. Ready? Let's go now. Corner pass. Okay, back up. That was easy.
Oh, I think actually there were 6-year-olds. I'm sure there were 6-year-olds in this study too. And so that's probably a 6-year-old child. You can see how the parents are holding hands with them as they cross roads.
Yeah, and this is just for your amusement. This was just a demonstration of our 2 agents, the safe agent and the risky agent. And this one, Carla here, who is closer to you, standing on the right-hand side in the screen, is going to be safe, and Carl on the left is going to be risky. So I'll just play you. So Carl crosses a smaller gap than Carla is willing to take. So that was just a demonstration of what these two different kinds of agents are and how they compare to one another. And lastly, we wanted to give a little bit of a look ahead to the kinds of things we're working on now and will be working on into the future. One of the really interesting directions we'd like to go, and this will be with our Safer Sim partners and with NADS, is to look at ways to connect our pedestrian and bicycling simulators up with driving simulators and have connected simulation systems in which people can share a virtual roadway while being physically in separate simulations. So there's an animation, or I mean a cartoon that shows this here for two bicycling simulators. One of the challenges is for you to share these environments, you need to have a representation of the other person in the environment, a computer-generated avatar. So one of the things we'd like to do is that's partly what motivated our work with agents, was to understand how much you need to capture about a person's motion to get natural interactions. And so we can place people in bodysuits, track their motions, and generate an avatar that mimics their behavior in another simulator. So we're interested in determining how to make natural avatar-mediated joint action to determine what the level of behavioral fidelity, how accurately do we need to track the motions of the participants in order to get realistic interactions. Tracking whole bodies is a challenge, even with very controlled environments. It's a particular challenge in a simulation like this because once you get close to the screens, it's very hard to get cameras placed where they can see the markers. So one of the things we're looking at is can we use reduced marker tracking, have a small number of markers that track, say, the head, hands, and feet, and then use inverse kinematics to fill in the rest of the joints? And does that give us a realistic enough motion that we can get natural interactions? So those are some of the things we'll be looking at. We're delighted that the second version of the UTC grant was recently funded, and this will permit us to do all sorts of interesting collaborative work with our Safer Sim partners. So I want to acknowledge the people in our lab who've contributed to this work. It's a large group of students and postdocs and staff members who make this all happen. I want to give a particular shout out to Yuan Zhang. This was the first and the third study where she basically took the lead on those studies, the study of the two people crossing and the avatar study. And Katie Brown, who had an important role in the two children study. And lastly, I want to acknowledge our sponsors for whom this could not happen. That includes National Institutes of Health, Safer Sim, the National Science Foundation, who have paid to build these simulators, the Department of Transportation, and the University of Iowa Injury Prevention Research Center. So now if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
And if any attendees here have any questions, feel free to just type them in the chat box. Joe, can you hear me now?
Give me a second. Oh, no.
I think I see Dawn is typing.
I'm curious to know how old.
Oh, so Dawn asks a question about crossing partners on opposite sides, which is an interesting question. We haven't looked at that, and to be honest, I don't think we spent too much time talking about it. And I think there are a variety, there are a whole collection of things that we could look at. One of the challenges with crossing from opposite sides of the screen in our simulator is that there's an open end to the simulator. So when you're on the opposite side, you look into the lab at the back end, and so that makes it difficult to do good simulations in both directions. That's why we haven't crossed one way and then walked back again.
But you could perhaps, I think, if you had, oh, you meant on the right side rather than the left? Oh. Oh, with the agents, yeah.
We yeah, so well, good. Yes, I do think we'll be interested on opposite sides. I think it'll be interesting, potentially you could look at multiple people. We're really interested in doing the avatar study where we have 2 pedestrians and 2 simulators and having them cross together. Overall, in the 2-person study, we didn't find too much difference between, you're slightly likely, I think it was 60% of the first crossers, the person who initiated the crossing tended to be on the left side. So there's some indication that in this environment with traffic coming from the left, that the person on the left tends to slightly more likely be a leader than the person on the right. We could put the agent on the right. That would be easy for us to do, although it just becomes that much less visible. And how that would influence the results, I don't think we're exactly sure.
Yeah, although in the parent-child study, the parent is always on the right, so that, and we did that so that we could see how the child might be leading the crossing. So there's some, way that we can look at it from that. But I think it'd be interesting if you looked at the opposite side of the road, because you could put your avatar on the other side so that you could see it coming across. And it's interesting to see whether people would be willing to also cross or be influenced by a partner who was crossing from the opposite direction. Because I think in real life, when you see somebody across from you on the street start to cross, maybe across a red light, you might be more willing to go too. They don't have to necessarily be right next to you.
Another study that we've talked about doing is combine this with texting. In an earlier webinar, we talked about our studies of pedestrian texting and information systems and how they influence road crossing while you're texting. And having 2 pedestrians that are texting, or even just having one texting, and then trying to see how the motions of the person next to them are influenced when you're texting and this person starts moving. I think that would be interesting to look at as well. I know one of the concerns on real intersections with pedestrian texting is that you're not really paying attention, and you tend to be more influenced by crowd behavior, group behavior, and so we could get a peek of that in the simulator.
Dawn.
Thank you, Dawn.
Does anybody else have questions?
Well, we'd love to hear other ideas. we really think this is a rich environment in which to conduct studies. We'd like to work with different population groups, so we're doing some studies, have done some studies with ADHD kids as well as typically developing kids. We haven't yet done anything with elderly populations, which I think would be a really interesting thing to do. We know that from the epidemiological data that elderly pedestrians have problems, and some of their problems seem to have some analog with the problems kids have in crossing roads. We've talked to some of our friends in neurology about working with neurological patients, Parkinson's disease patients, and other kinds of patients. So there are tons of things we could do.
So Tim has a question. Have you done work with individuals on the autism spectrum? No, we haven't, but that would also be another group that would be interesting to look at. I think that, I can't remember, have you guys, at NADS, you've done some work with autism spectrum individuals, I think, and it would be interesting to look at them as pedestrians as well, either kids or young adults, I think.
Great. Well, thanks all for being here virtually. I've left our webpage up here on the screen for a moment longer, so you can go there to learn more about the lab. We're delighted to hear from people. We always appreciate suggestions, ideas about good things to do using this great facility. And if you're ever in the area, we'd be delighted to give you a demo. So thanks very much.
Yep, thank you.